when a building inspector just checked out what was supposed to be an abandoned building that had activity in it. And what they discovered eventually over time was an illegal medical lab that contained bioengineered mice and infectious agents, including HIV and COVID-19. In fact, the bioengineered mice were actually engineered to more readily get COVID-19 and more readily spread COVID-19. Mice, what better agent to kind of inflict and spread a COVID-19 virus than to have mice carrying it and easily carrying it into buildings, into homes, and spreading the disease like the Black Plague that afflicted Europe centuries ago. That's what this biolab had within it: 1,000 mice, 200 of which were dead, 800 which needed to be euthanized, who had been bioengineered to carry the disease COVID-19. This wasn't in 2020. This wasn't in 2021. This is a building that was defunct, that was discovered in 2020, late 2022, by a building inspector who said, wait a second, there's not supposed to be any activity going there. And then in investigating, they discovered there were lots of problems. In March, they finally got an inspection into the building. And then finally, in this month, we end up finding out that it was an entire bioweapons lab. A bioweapons lab in Reedley, California. Well, why would you want a bioweapons lab in Reedley, California? You think that and it's owned by Chinese interests and run by Chinese interests illegally, of course. And so why would you want a lab in Reedley, California? You were trying to take out the world's fruit basket? No, you're not. What you're trying to do is something very simple. Reedley is 50 miles from Lemoore Naval Air Station. Lemoore Naval Air Station happens to be the place where F-18 Super Hornets, half of our F-18 Super Hornet fleet is actually parked there. They train there. That's where they're based. That's the main base on the West Coast for our Pacific Fleet, for the main attack aircraft on our aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet. So what's obvious is, if you wanted to actually create a biohazard where your pilots are being trained, where your pilots are being housed, where your pilots' families are being housed. That's what the target of the Reedley lab was. It wasn't for the world fruit basket. It was the Pacific Fleet, a Chinese entity that was operating illegally in Reedley, California, and has a license to operate in Nevada, happened to have bioengineered mice to spread COVID 50 miles from Lemoore Naval Air Station. Folks, if that didn't scare the hell out of you, I don't know what will. The Chinese are playing for keeps. They're planning on playing for keeps. And meanwhile, we can't stop a stupid satellite balloon from floating over our country and transmitting secret information back to the Chinese, all the while we're told by the Defense Department that they were jamming the signals when they weren't. When we blow up the balloon later using a missile that's designed to kill the actual components of the balloon, rather than just taking down the balloon and capturing the components and finding exactly what the Chinese were doing. I mean, we have a corrupted system. And now we see by the level of infiltration into our own country that the Chinese have maintained. And this was found not because of any great Department of Homeland Security effort. It wasn't found because of any great FBI intelligence effort. It's found because somebody complained to a building inspector that an abandoned building was being used. And the building inspector went out, saw the hose was being run into the building through the wall. And that made no sense. And it took 3 months to get around, after inquiries and everything, just the normal bureaucratic procedures in local government, to finally get a building inspection. And the building inspectors go in and they find something they don't understand. And they say, wait a second, this is insane. And so what do you end up with? You end up with eventually having the CDC called in, and they discover over 20 different diseases had been bioengineered there. And the facility at one point had capacity of making COVID tests and other and pregnancy tests. That's what it essentially at some point was supposedly doing. This is got to be the scariest story I've come across because it shows the level of infiltration that we're seeing.